Thursday, and that means it's time to throw it back for another Throwback Thursday. Joining me today is Lori Kent with the Local Lou podcast.
Good morning, and happy birthday to my history girly.
Oh, thank you. And there's nothing more I would want on my birthday than to throw it back with Lori Kent. So I'm excited for this.
I mean, I'm sad that we aren't going to be right in the high seas, but
I know. Erin was trying to convince her to talk, in a pirate voice this whole time, but I said she didn't have to. You don't have to because I'm not very good.
No, we're actually going to head west this time. We're going to go to Faith, South Dakota and Custer, South Dakota, where they have historical markers that are related to our state's first poet laureate. So Charles Badger Clark Jr., he was born in 1883 in Albion, Iowa, but he actually ends up spending most of his life in Dakota Territory / South Dakota once we become a state. And so he ends up here because his dad is a Civil War veteran, he's recovering, he's going to be a farmer for a little while, but really his calling is to be a minister. And so his dad actually has a claim to some Wild West fame himself. He presides over the funeral of Calamity Jane. So he makes sure that she gets a proper funeral, which I think says a lot about his dad's character. But Badger Clark himself, actually his life is sort of ruled by death and tuberculosis, sort of. His brother and his mother both die of tuberculosis within a couple years of each other. And he then ends up kind of running away a little bit. He does this, he does that, and he ends up in Cuba for a couple years, spends a little time in prison because he witnessed a crime, so it's not too salacious. And then he's on the outside of Tombstone, Arizona, which again, another huge connection to Wild West fame with the OK Corral, but he's there in the early 1900s, and he's there to be a ranch hand. And this is when he kind of gets to observe and absorb that cowboy culture. From that, he writes a letter to his stepmother, and in that is a poem that she thinks is so good, she sends it off to a magazine, and they publish it and send him $10, which is well over $100 now, so that's pretty good for a poem. And he then is on his way to becoming a full-time poet after that. He ends up here back in South Dakota after his father's illness. Kind of his dad's getting older, he's not as in great health as he could be, and so Badger wants to be close to him. At this time, he is officially known as Badger Clark. He's dropped the Charles and the Junior, which I think is a cool name anyway, very cowboy, very rugged. And he's going to get to be known as the cowboy poet. One of his famous poems is A Cowboy's Prayer, although it a lot of times ends up saying it's written by anonymous, but it's not. It's written by Badger Clark. Wow. And so when his father's sick and he's taking care of him, his stepmother loans him some money so he can write a collection of poems called Sun and Saddle Leather. And so that gets him going, and he eventually, after his father passes away, he gets a cabin in Custer State Park, and then he builds his own cabin in Custer State Park, which is kind of cool, and he gets to spend the rest of his life there. He becomes our first poet laureate in South Dakota in 1937. Now, not a lot of money in that title, but he gets a little prestige. He gets to travel around. He gets to do talks and share his poetry with the masses. And so it's really cool. He dies in 1957 of lung cancer.
Wow, what an interesting life. To live and to go to Cuba and all these different places, and then come back to South Dakota.
And it definitely shapes who he was. And so there's a documentary called Badger Clark, A Poet Among the Pines, and there's a showing of it this weekend at the Vortex Film Festival in Vermilion on Saturday, and I have a Q&A with the director, Brad Dumke, right afterwards, and you get to learn a lot about Badger Clark through that documentary. And then I have a new episode out too. I mean, it should have been for your birthday. I didn't think it through. but there's a new episode of Local Lou out that talks a lot more about the historical markers related to Badger Clark.
I'm definitely going to be checking that out. This is one of my favorite stories, so
awesome.
How fitting for my birthday. Thank you for coming
Happy
in.
birthday.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll be back after the break.